Predestination. Theological controversy over predestination has caused great confusion in the religious lives of many people. In the Bible, we find many passages which are often interpreted to mean that everything in human life, prosperity and decline, happiness and misery, salvation and damnation, and even the rise and fall of nations, comes to pass exactly as predestined by God. Yet we can find sufficient evidence in the Bible to refute the doctrine of absolute predestination. With such ample grounds in the Bible to justify either of these two contrasting doctrines, how does a divine principle resolve this issue? The predestination of God's will. God could not accomplish his purpose of creation due to the human fall. Accordingly, God's will in carrying out his providence for fallen humanity is still to accomplish the purpose of creation. In this sense, God's will is that restoration be accomplished. God is the absolute, unique, eternal, and unchanging being. Therefore, his will must also be absolute, unique, and unchanging. The predestination of God's will is absolute. The predestination of the fulfillment of God's will. Although God's will of the providence of restoration is absolute and beyond human influence, its fulfillment necessarily requires the accomplishment of the human portion of responsibility. God predestines the process of its fulfillment conditionally, contingent upon the completion of the 5% human responsibility, in addition to the 95% responsibility of God. The proportion of 5% is used to indicate that the human portion of responsibility is extremely small when compared to God's portion of responsibility. Yet, for human beings, this 5% is equivalent to 100% of our effort. The predestination of the fulfillment of God's will is conditional. The predestination of human beings. Adam and Eve were to become the good ancestors of humanity, conditional upon fulfilling their responsibility to obey God's commandment not to eat of the fruit. Accordingly, God did not absolutely predestine that Adam and Eve would become our good ancestors. Even though God predestines a person for a particular mission, God's responsibility and the person's responsibility must be accomplished together before the person can complete his given mission and fulfill God's will. Hence, if the person does not complete his responsibility, he cannot become the person God has purposed him to be. The predestination of human beings is conditional. The book of Romans says, "Those whom he foreknew, he also predestined. Those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified." Predestining and calling the person is God's responsibility. But only when the person completes his responsibility after being called by God is he justified. Hence, God's predestination concerning an individual's glorification is thus contingent upon the fulfillment of his portion of responsibility. Because this Bible verse omits to mention human responsibility, people may misinterpret it to mean that all affairs are determined solely by God's absolute predestination.